The National Aeronautics and Space Administration has undertaken a research program to document methods and techniques used by general aviation pilots to land aircraft. For this program, 22 pilots using 2 modern instrumented light aircraft made a series of landings on a short and a long runway. The landing sequences shown in this supplement are presented to exemplify some of the desirable and undesirable piloting practices observed during this study. Part of the ground tracking system used for data purposes is seen as a grid in the foreground of each sequence. The first approach and landing is of the low-wing aircraft using the long runway. The approach is a stabilized, steady flight path, and the pilot has the airspeed well under control. The flare is a smooth transition from the approach to the touchdown, which is on the main landing gear in a nose-high attitude. This approach and landing by another pilot is again of the low-wing aircraft using the long runway. The approach is high with several flight path deviations, and the airspeed is excessive. The initial flare is high. This is followed by an overflare and floating with the landing well down the runway. The next 2 landings are with the high-wing aircraft using the long runway. The first approach is well planned and executed with good airspeed control. The flare is a smooth transition leading into a touchdown on the main landing gear with the nose wheel well clear of the runway. The pilot lowers the nose wheel as the airspeed begins to dissipate. This landing, however, is not nearly as well executed. The approach is slightly high with numerous deviations in the flight path. The airspeed is quite slow, and the aircraft is almost stalled about 25 feet above the runway. This sets up a high sink rate that carries through to a nose-low touchdown, and the aircraft bounces. The actual landing is rather firm. The following 2 sequences show landings of the high-wing aircraft using the short runway. This landing is made with no noted discrepancies. The approach, flare, and touchdown are well executed. This approach is high and steep with excessive airspeed. The flare is late, and the aircraft is landed in a nose-low attitude. The pilot over-controls, and the excessive airspeed allows the aircraft to become airborne and then bounce. These landing sequences are typical examples of landings made during this study. The results of some 600 landings generally show that most of the approaches were fast with considerable floating during the flares and with touchdowns that were relatively flat or nose low. The approaches to the short runway were slightly steeper and at the threshold were lower and slower than those to the long runway. In addition, the landings on the short runway were made closer to the threshold than those on the long runway.